Minnesota's former highest-ranking Republican says Governor Tim Walz doesn't belong in the White House. Details from his brand new book, next. Paul Gazelka, the former Minnesota Senate Majority Leader, had a front row seat to what he calls the governor's greatest leadership failures during his first term in office. Gazelka has exposed them in his new book. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks, Liz. And I don't even think I exposed them all, but I exposed enough of them to say he is not ready to be the VP for the United States of America. Right? I mean, in a crisis, he just doesn't know how to lead. He makes bad decisions. And when he has power, he abuses the power. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, behind the veil, it is quite eye-opening. Talk a little bit more about that, why you felt that this book was necessary.
You know, I wrote the book in January and finished it in 6 months. And I just wanted to capture all of the unique moments of being a legislator. And it was, I just finished it and I just set it down. I thought, I don't know if I'm going to print it or publish it or not. And then suddenly Tim Walz rises all the way up and becomes the VP candidate. And I said, look, I got to put this out. I feel like he is applying for the second most highest position in the country. And I'm the reference that says, don't hire him. And so, I was pretty direct. I'm always respectful. I think everybody around the Capitol knows I'm civil, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't say the truth when I see it.
And certainly a lot has happened during your 14 years in St. Paul, especially as you're talking about here during the time you spent with Governor Tim Walz during his first term. We have the pandemic, the George Floyd riots, the state budget. You've served with plenty of other Democrats, though, in the past. It sounds like, just in some conversations I've had with you before, there was something different about Walz, something you experienced firsthand.
Yeah, I got along really well with Mark Dayton and both Speaker Hortman, both of them very liberal, but we found pragmatic ways to find solutions. And a handshake deal was a handshake deal. And Tim Walz started out where I thought, well, it's going to be more of the same. We fixed MNLARS. That was a license and registration services was just botched by the state of Minnesota. And we Republicans were saying we need a third party to look at this. And finally, he agreed to do that. I thought, well, this could be okay. And then the first budget, he had all his grand dreams of a progressive agenda. And I said, we're not doing any of those. And he said, and he needed to raise taxes. He said 12 billion, or he didn't say it, but that's how we calculated it. And I said, we're not raising any taxes, we're lowering them. And in the end, we actually did lower taxes. It was the biggest tax cut in Minnesota history. And now he's taking credit for it on his stump, at the Democratic National Convention. He's bragging about the biggest tax cut. I'm thinking he wanted tax increases. But up to that point, I thought this will be okay until he got emergency powers. And that's when we just drifted farther and farther apart, because emergency powers are like king-like powers. That means I can suggest what he should do, but I have really no way of stopping him. And then we can walk through COVID and the riots and decisions he made. It was all when he had those emergency powers.
Yeah, let's talk more about that with COVID. Minnesota had some of the most extreme lockdowns in the country, the same with the vaccine rollout and mandates there. Walz, as you're saying, essentially gives himself emergency powers without any legislative input. What should people know? What was happening behind the scenes during that time?
Yeah, and the governor can declare emergency powers, but the House and Senate, if they agree, can take them away. And the problem was the House was controlled by Democrats. He's in the same party. They just didn't want to do that. They finally did do that, by the way, against his wishes. But so he's making these decisions, and I can see some of them are not going the right direction. And at first, we passed 3 different bills that almost $500 million of money right away. So we proved that the House and Senate in an emergency could do what we need to do to provide for the emergency. But then he started making decisions on what was going to be open, what was going to be closed. He started, we're going to close surgical centers because he was taking their equipment. And I'm looking at the numbers and I'm saying, Governor, I look over at New York and I see that they have 4 times the population and they don't have anywhere near the beds needed for COVID that you're saying is going to be in Minnesota. And he said, well, if we lock down in 2 weeks, we're going to lock down. Only 40 or 50,000 people are going to die. And I looked at the same data around the whole country and the world, and I have it in the book too. I messaged a constituent that said, I think it's going to be 5,000 people. And yes, it's going to be serious, and it's going to be mostly people over 70. So he misinterpreted the data, and all of his decisions were based on that. And, one classic example was, okay, bars, you get 50 people now. They were closed, but now you get 50. But churches, you get 10. And whatever you do, don't sing. So it's like, who gives you the right to do that? Eventually the churches, I did Zoom meetings with them privately, the head of the Catholic Church in our area and leaders in the Protestant community. And eventually they said, we're going to open up. We don't care what the governor says. We wanted to work with him, but we are going to go against his wishes. That's when they brought him back to the table privately, and they agreed on 250 people in a service. But there's so many decisions that were bad. I'll just bring up one more if I can. The morgue. So the governor said, we're going to need a morgue because all these people are going to die. And I thank God I have all these text strings because I can go back and see exactly what I said and what he said. And I said to him at that point, why don't we just lease a building? And on the phone, I told him, why don't we do freezer trucks like other states were doing? But when he made up his mind, he just did it because he didn't have to stop for anybody. He could do whatever he wanted to do. And that morgue was never used.
It's months later, the summer of 2020. This is all going on basically at the same time. The George Floyd riots, or those peaceful protests, as they're called. The governor seemed comfortable. It seemed from the get-go, spreading lies, pushing this anti-police rhetoric. For days, Walz, the governor of Minnesota, nowhere to be found. You were there, desperate for a plan, something I witnessed really firsthand through my husband. But share a bit of your perspective about that time.
That was the most frustrating time with me and Governor Walz, because it was like, literally, he was frozen. I'm pretty sure I was the first one to say he's frozen because he just wouldn't act. George Floyd died on a Monday. It was terrible. The video, it was very gripping. The riots started Tuesday, and they should have had a clue then. But certainly by Wednesday, the riots were full blown. The mayor of Minneapolis asked for help, and the governor sat on his hands. He did nothing. On Thursday, he had 190 guard members out. I don't know where. They ended up burning down the 3rd precinct. 1,500 buildings were damaged or destroyed, mostly minority. I'm texting the governor, where's the guard? Where are you? And he was very defensive. He started getting into this spat about I should call Bob Kroll. And, I hadn't talked to Bob in 2 months, but I did call Bob Kroll and try to get him to link to the governor because he was just so defensive rather than taking decisive action. Then Friday comes along and he says, I'm in charge now. They don't enforce the curfew. Wells Fargo burns down. And I am livid because he is destroying Minneapolis and St. Paul. I ended up calling the White House and asked, can you guys help? Because he is frozen. And then I went on Kier 11 and talked to Julie Nelson after 10:30. They have the screen is burning of Minneapolis. And she's saying, where's the governor? And then, I texted the governor again, where are you? And it was just like, he just didn't act. And, finally Saturday, he got the guard out in full force. They began to stop the rioting, but it was something he should have done on Wednesday. And then he tried to deflect. It's the mayor's fault. And then the mayor proved it wasn't. They're only 19-year-old cooks, the National Guard members, which I think was a real slap in the face. But we did a hearing in the Senate in July after. We brought in General John Jensen of the National Guard, and we asked him point blank, if you had been called up earlier, could you have stopped this? And he said, in my unprofessional police opinion, yes. In my professional military opinion, yes. End of story. If Governor Walz had acted like a strong leader we would have avoided all of those problems.
What I remember about that time also, Paul, is you and Bob are going back and forth. And I actually still have video on my phone to this day because I just thought this was a remarkable piece of history to be witnessing. There was a plan. There, you guys together, Bob has military experience, and there had been riots in Minneapolis before as a longtime police officer that he had handled it as well in leadership positions. He pushed out this plan to you. You said, is it okay if I put you in touch with the governor? Bob says, absolutely. I want to talk to him. Something needs to be happening. Walz never made that phone call.
Yeah. And I reached out to Bob. I said, he's my main contact in Minneapolis. What would you do? And he knew exactly what to do. And if Walz had had a better relationship with the police, we could have stopped this. That may have been the encouragement he would have needed. And, another interesting point about the whole thing is, I believe it was Friday night, but from my Senate office, I could see into the Capitol, and I could see all the police groups beginning to stage down there. And so I went under the tunnel, went into the basement, and all of these groups, conservation officers, police officers from all over the region, everyone was getting ready in the basement of the Capitol. And I think it was Mike Ledoux of the Highway Patrol took me from group to group so that I could thank them that they were ready to put their own lives on the line to bring peace back to Minnesota. And later, I was told that Governor Tim Walz never showed up, never talked to them. And, the fact is that doesn't surprise me, because if you look after we got the riots under control, now there was this big push for anti-police legislation. And I said, we're not doing that. I thought if I can find things we can agree on that the police support, that we think is good for policing, I'm willing to do it. But many of their things were anti-police, and the governor was pushing those, and I just wasn't going to let him get it done.
Not only that, I've heard that Walz actually scolded police officers for drinking his coffee near his office while cops were stationed at the Capitol. There's been so much that has come out about just that anti-police sentiment by the governor.
Yeah, you shouldn't wonder why not one major police group endorsed him for governor, and I doubt they will for, being the VP, unless they don't know where he really was. But yeah, it was a really tragic time. I'm glad it's over. Once they began to do it the right way, I didn't have any complaints. But now you're VP candidate, you don't get do-overs against Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. I mean, you need leaders that make the right decision right away, not 5 days too late.
And during that same summer, Governor Walz allowed the statue of Christopher Columbus to be torn down in front of the Capitol. That statue stood since 1931, a gift from Italian Americans to the state of Minnesota. Walz said he understood why the statue was toppled. He promised consequences. There were none. No jail or prison time for anyone involved in any of the related crimes. You explain in your book that Walz knew the mob was coming for the statue. He did nothing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was so frustrating, because I was having a meal at Casetta's, and I got a call from our folks in the Senate, which can basically see, not quite, but almost to the place where the statue is. They said, you're going to believe this. They're tearing down the statue of Christopher Columbus. And so I got up there right away. So I began to look into it, because it was like he had put on Facebook, Mike Furcia, that he intended to go up to the Capitol and tear the statue down of Christopher Columbus. And so the governor definitely knew about that, and he put one highway patrol out right in front of the statue. And as this group of somewhere less than 100 people came up there, Mike Furcia had a rope in his hand, and he's talking to that highway patrol, and then the highway patrol walks back into the Capitol, where there's scores of highway patrol that could have been there to defend it. And he puts the rope over the statue and pulls it down, and then puts his foot on the neck like he did something great when he didn't do something great. And, but the governor to not be prepared for that, and to allow this symbol that many of us think is important to just be torn down by a mob, it's totally unacceptable. I mean, if you're really going to take a statue away, it should be a legislative process where the voice of the people is what determines what's going to happen. And, one interesting point about that, down at Mancini's, that family was at that event in the 1930s, their grandfather, and the fact that they witnessed this when they were the minority group then, and they wanted to be part of Minnesota, and that was their contribution to Minnesota. I mean, it was terrible and ironic that the Mike Forcia invited the Somalis and the Hmong to come with him because they're the immigrants, when it was like the Italians were the immigrants then. And so, again, it was a sign of leadership that was just not executed well.
Also in 2020, you saw two Iron Range Democratic senators leave the Democratic Senate caucus to join you. What does that say about the state of the Democratic Party, even back then in Minnesota?
Well, it says that the direction that Tim Walz has taken our state was not where they wanted to go. It was Tom Bach and David Tomasoni, both from the Iron Range. And it helped that I came from that area. It helped that I worked at Mintech one summer. But Tom and I built a good relationship, and he was the leader, Democrat leader of the Senate before me. But in the end, he just said, look, they don't stand up for our way of life and mining. And they had a big fight over that pipeline, the Enbridge pipeline that went through northern Minnesota to replace an old 6-year-old pipe with a new one. And each one of these things, the governor was in the way. And so they said, we really are old Democrats, but we'd rather be with you because you guys are leading the direction we think Minnesota should go. And that's never happened in Minnesota before, that two at one time defected to the other side.
On that note, I think it is important to look back on the big picture with important elections coming up in Minnesota. What should voters think about and do this time around? As you pointed out in 2019, so much of this never passed. And then we saw what happened when the DFL trifecta took over.
Yeah, and I try to remind people that both in Minnesota and nationally, because Governor Walz tries to present himself as this voice for rural America. And it's just like the opposite of what he tried to do, even from 2019, 20, 21, 22. I mean, they wanted to do a new flag without bipartisan support back in 19. They did it in 2023 when they had House, Senate, Governor. They wanted to raise $12 billion of taxes while they raised $10 billion. They wanted a driver's license for illegal immigrants. We wouldn't let them. That now happened. They wanted this extreme Green New Deal in 19. We didn't let them happen, but it did pass in 2023, where utility companies, they have to have 100% renewable or carbon free by 2040. And there's no way they can get there, because when there's no sun, solar doesn't work well. When it's below 22 below, wind doesn't work well. There's not enough nuclear to cover the difference. And I don't know what they're thinking they're going to do when we get there. And the abortion, they went extreme on abortion. They wanted to in 2019. In 2023, they wiped out all the common sense compromises we had, Democrats and Republicans. For example, if a young woman wanted to have a baby, they didn't have a lot of money, they were going to have the baby, we provided resources in Minnesota to help that young woman succeed. It was called the Positive Alternative Act. They took all the money out of that. Now, if a 16-year-old girl is pregnant, parents are not notified. They used to be notified. Every simple provision that most people in Minnesota, I think, would agree with, they took them all out. So one thing after the other, they just eliminated. I mean, I had pages of things I marked down that they were. I'll give you one more that just came to mind. He's not business savvy, so he doesn't understand small business. And they passed this paid family leave bill that will tax every employer, every employee. And if you're an employer with one employee, that employee can take up to 20 weeks off a year if they're eligible. I mean, and if somebody wants to milk the system, well, that doesn't work. I mean, it's going to destroy small businesses. And so each thing, it was like they didn't think through the consequences. They just bowled them through. And if you think about that, if that's what he does at Minnesota, what is he going to do, federally? And one more comes to mind. So in 2023, they increased spending in 1 year 40%. We had an $18 billion surplus. They blew all of that. They raised taxes $10 billion. And according to my nonpartisan fiscal staff in the Senate, there is a structural deficit into the future. And so if he did that in Minnesota, what are they going to do in the federal government?
Finally, are you concerned at all about all of this information coming out about his ties to China?
I knew that he taught over in China. I didn't know that he was there 30 times. And, it certainly gives me pause to reflect on, what does that mean for how he's going to relate to China? I'm not an expert in that area, and I try to focus only on what I really know because I can speak it, with authority. I don't speak about his military record either, but people are, and I don't speak about his daughter and his wife that have said things towards my way that I don't bring them into the fray. But all of the things I mentioned, plus those things that other people are talking about, should make people very concerned about what kind of leader he'd be at the federal level.
Such an important book. Behind the Veil is available now on Amazon. But Paul Gazelka, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Liz.
That'll do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We will see you next time.